Hello, I'm Sean Lambert. Today we're going to be talking about defense in depth. And this is one of my favorite topics. A lot of videos and doctrine and books have been written about offensive doctrine and offensive warfare in general, breakthrough strategies, all these fancy pieces of equipment that can help break through the enemy. But I want to talk about something a little bit more bread and butter. And the way we're going to talk about defense in depth is at three main levels: the tactical level, the operational level, and the strategic level. And we're going to have three examples from history and from wargaming. So I'm actually going to start at the strategic level, or at least the operational. This example is kind of a mix of both. Let's start by talking about the strategic level, and then we'll slowly narrow our focus to the tactical level. So this is a mock-up of a hypothetical, well, maybe not so hypothetical, war in Ukraine between the Russians in red and the NATO forces in blue. And one of the things you'll immediately notice is I don't have near enough NATO forces put down on the map, and that's because we're going to go through some examples on how to set up a defense in depth at the strategic level. So let's say that each of these represents either a brigade or a battalion, a large formation. So whatever period of warfare we're in, this is kind of period agnostic. We're just talking about the overall strategy of how you would perform a defense in depth. And one of the interesting things that you'll see throughout history is that as the enemy force's firepower increases, your level of dispersion as the defender also increases. So they move together. And this is something we saw in 2022's Ukrainian invasion, where the Ukrainians were forced to disperse their forces early on in the war. So instead of tightly guarding cities like Kiev and Kharkiv, they ended up having to spread their forces out, especially their anti-aircraft defenses. So instead of having guys in useful places where they could actually defend, they had to hide them, and they had to turn them off, essentially. They couldn't fight back in the early phase of the war for fear of having their anti-aircraft defenses targeted by the first wave of cruise missiles and aerial attacks. So that is step one of a good defense in depth, is understanding the balance of forces. If you are a strategy thinker and you're planning for a war against a superior foe, be it Ukraine versus Russia, North Vietnam versus the United States, South Korea versus North Korea, if you are facing a numerically or firepower superior foe, it is best to have your forces dispersed. That way, any one attack can't destroy everything. That's one of the fundamental concepts of defense in depth. So at the strategic level, what this also means is making sure your production is not all in one place, making sure your political leaders are not all in one place. And this is something that, for example, the United States has a very strict system of having to have the chain of succession to the presidency split up. You can't have them all in the same room at once. That has been the subject of many Tom Clancy novels and movies and TV shows. But that the general principle of dispersion applies not only to military force, but to your economic and political forces as well. And even to some extent your civilians, evacuating areas of higher density, which is probably the hardest thing to do and the thing that would most often be neglected. But even early in the war in Kiev, or in the advance towards Kiev, there was a lot of talk about evacuating the city. It's just very hard to do. So let's jump into our example here at the strategic level. So let's say we have a bunch of factories in all of our major cities. and we know that we're going to lose some of them. Well, in World War II, what the Soviets did was they had a lot of factories in Kharkov, for example. So they took those factories and they moved them way over here. And so without the factories at risk anymore, they were able to, fight their battles without fearing for a total loss of their military productive capacity. So that's the strategic level, is mostly thinking about dispersing your forces and then about being able to ramp up your production and economic power towards war making over time without destabilizing your country and your economy. So the political side of things comes into play. After you get invaded, how are you going to maintain your political stability? Is it going to be through an iron fist approach, or are you going to be more of your, try to keep things as normal as possible? And in Germany in World War II, and in the West in World War II to some extent, the approach was to basically keep the civilians as happy as possible. But as the war continued, you had to mobilize more and more of your resources and manpower and civilian productive capacity towards making war. So strategically, that depth of having a lot of stuff that you can transition. So when you're considering an offensive war or a defensive war, you have to take into account how much of your country's resources can you put towards that war over time. Will that number grow or shrink? And you have to build your strategy around that. So knowing your own country. Now, for the most part, in today's day and age, countries are very industrialized. They have incredible depth of productive capacity, but that was not always the case. Many times throughout history, the weaker country would get weaker over time, not stronger. I would say the main change of industrialization is that your country can actually strengthen over time, because even losing half your country, you can rebuild factories and throw your huge manpower at these problems. Huge, I say, relative to historical levels of manpower and resource levels. So, like, say you are Ukraine in 1750 instead of in 2022, you're in a much different situation. You don't have the ability to ramp up your productive capacity at all, and you don't really have allies. So that political and economic factor of do you have allies? Do you have your economy? Is it linked to other economies elsewhere? That's a really important part of the strategic version of defense in depth. It's not just about where you place your forces. It's about how many of the forces do you have available at the start versus how many can you generate. And that's, again, going back to the World War II example, one of the big underestimations of the Axis against the Soviets was that they underestimated their strategic depth. The Soviets had a huge army, the biggest army in the world at the beginning of World War II. But they also had the among the biggest, if not the biggest, ability to generate additional forces, because they had an intense version of mobilization. They were willing to basically do whatever it took to get tanks and vehicles onto the battlefield. And they were able to sustain losses because they had that political and economic depth, something that they didn't have in 1917 or really in most prior wars in recent history to World War II. They were looking back, 20, 30, maybe 50 years. But if you look back to the Napoleonic Wars, you see the same thing. Immense political and economic strategic depth. The key to defeating Napoleon in 1812 was that they were able to politically suffer these huge defeats and suffer losing half your country, and yet still hold on, still keep resisting in some way. And that political depth is very, very important to not just bend, not just instantly shatter into a million pieces just because you start losing. Being on the losing side, being on the defensive side, often means you're also on the losing side initially. Same with Vietnam. In Vietnam, obviously they were facing a tremendous amount of firepower for a very long time, but they had the will to resist, and they never lost that will. And that is a very difficult thing to defeat. If you look back through history, places where the political and economic depth exists alongside some sort of military strategy that is at least workable, usually they end up winning in the long run. So unless your politics and economics fall apart at the strategic level, your defense in depth is pretty strong. Now let's talk a little bit more about the operational level. And I'm going to use the same map, but I'm going to actually start moving some stuff around. So operational depth essentially means keeping your logistics in place. So let's say you have these 5 brigades, let's call them, and you are wondering, will I be able to hold out against the enemy forces that are attacking me? Well, one thing is where are they deployed. Sometimes that's the most obvious thing in defense in depth, is that you have forces that are deployed forward, and then you have reserves behind them, and then you have some sort of mobile force that you can bring in. So let's say we have we don't want him to be red now, do we? So let's say we have a tank force behind all of this, and he is kind of our mobile reserve here in this case. So the Russians have come down the road, they've blasted through the border, and they are trying to head for an encirclement of Kharkov. So what are we going to be able to do to stop them? Well, one of the important things is that we have to be able to react at multiple levels. So our initial defense can either be strong or weak. Throughout history, there have been different strategies around the outer shell of your defense in depth. In particular, historically, the Germans had a strategy in World War I, and then later in World War II as well. They never really changed their defensive strategies, where their outer lines were very, very weakly held. Generally just small platoons or even just sections of like a machine gun team here, machine gun team there, maybe a couple infantry scattered around as essentially an early warning system, so that as the enemy came out of their trenches and advanced, they were able to detect them and get everyone else ready. The problem they faced with that during World War II was that the Russians would simply go around them. So instead of trying to go through the outer sentries, the Russians knew that you could just drive around them, and then suddenly you're at their real defensive line, and this real defensive line maybe is a lot stronger, but is not always on full readiness. So that's one of the keys, is you can't keep all your forces on full readiness all the time, otherwise they're going to get exhausted. So at the operational level, you really want to be prepared to ready your main force, but you want some way to detect the enemy ahead of time. So in modern times, there's a lot of tools we have to use that. And you saw in Ukraine, one of the big tools is satellite imagery. Another is just basic intelligence. During World War II, this was very, very important. Just reconnaissance, forward observing, the basics of warfare. Really, at the operational level, can help you decide where to put your supply dumps so that they are not going to be immediately exposed, and so that your entire logistics system can't get subverted in some way by an enemy advance. So protecting your logistics with either a mobile reserve or with your main force is really, really important. So that's the main difference between your tactical strategy and your more operational level defense in depth. Is it is centered around your logistics, and your operational depth has to be, you can't rely on one road to bring in all your logistics. You can't rely on one railroad to bring in all your logistics. You have to have the dispersion of your ability to supply your forces, because you can't have a single point of failure in a defensive line. Otherwise, by cutting that one point of failure off, you suddenly don't have the ability to fight in a sustained battle. And this was a major component of the American strategy in Vietnam, was trying to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The problem was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, although it seemed like it was a single road, it was not really a single source of supply, and it could be rerouted and quickly repaired. So just because you can disrupt it temporarily doesn't mean that you can have it completely destroyed. And so part of the depth of the Ho Chi Minh Trail was the ability to just keep pushing through and keep it running. Similar to like the Red Ball Express in World War II, is it had to keep moving, it had to keep running. And that's something today would be very difficult in some cases in certain areas of the world, where if you were having a war in some inhospitable place like the Arctic or a desert, for example, that part of your strategy is actually maybe the hardest part of your war, because you have to deal with the terrain for your logistics. So defending in something like that is really hard. Attacking is hard too, but defending is really hard because you don't know exactly where is safe for your supplies. And in Arctic warfare or in desert warfare in particular, you have mobility issues, so you can't change your mind all that easily. And keeping your logistic line running is very challenging in the best conditions. So keeping it running when you're in really bad conditions is damn near impossible. So there's a lot of war games that are built around that exact problem of can you protect your supply lines, or can you attack the enemy's supply lines? Finally, we have the tactical level. And at the tactical level, things can be a lot more varied. Let's zoom into a more tactical battle here. And let's get some more realistic positions. So let's say we have this map here is not terribly great for seeing 3D effects. But let's say we're coming down a road here. Like, we'll call this river line a road, even though I think it's pretty clear that it's a river line. But for example's sake, we'll call this river the road. And we want to be able to detect and subvert the enemy attack along this road. Maybe the enemy's objective is further back. How would we defend against something like this, where the enemy has the much higher firepower force and we are just a bunch of infantry guys trying to hold the line? Well, one strategy, like I discussed earlier, the German strategy is to just lightly hold it with a couple of sections here, and then have their main line further back, like as far back as they could really get it. And this kind of setup is, like I said, weak to them saying, okay, well, we'll just go around your initial force and attack your main force. And then suddenly your main force you're still the weaker side, but now you are fighting in an unprepared battle. Versus if the enemy decided to go right down through the middle, these guys would see them, radio back, and you'd be able to get your anti-tank weapons in place so that you can deal with this armored threat. So it wouldn't be able to just drive right through you. That's the idea of a defense at depth. Now, if you're facing more of a traditional threat where you are first So this is actual Soviet doctrine here. So you wouldn't actually be facing these tank guys initially. What you'd probably be facing is some sort of infiltration tactic, in combination with a lot of artillery. So these guys would try to sneak up in the middle of the night, or potentially in broad daylight. They would get off here and they would engage these forces. So you would be on readiness in your back line. But the problem is you can't be on high readiness forever. So you have to rely on being able to bring in additional forces. And this is kind of where the defense in depth can be broken down. One of the big strategies of World War I, and really of industrial war in general, is you have artillery to suppress the reinforcements or enemy artillery. So let's say that we have some good guy artillery over here, some blue artillery. Where are you going to put that to defend your guys up here? You would really want it out of the range of the enemy artillery. So let's say the enemy artillery can only reach like back to here, and you're just out of the range. But the problem is you can't shoot necessarily the enemy artillery with your artillery. So a lot of the times the trade-off is you have to put some of your forces at risk to adequately protect your infantry. Otherwise, what can happen is you have some of your infantry get engaged by infiltrators. You get your main line suppressed by the artillery. So these guys all come under attack, and suddenly they're all suppressed and they can't do anything. So they have to start dispersing themselves or retreating or something to deal with that, or they go into their bunkers and hold out. And then while that's all going on, you have the enemy armor coming up and trying to drive straight through. And so then in your tactical defense in depth, you ideally don't want them to be able to get right on top of your artillery or logistics or whatever your rear area stuff is. So ideally what you would have is a second line behind that first one. So then they run into that. Well, what happens if the enemy artillery is actually targeting your second line first, or that they have some sort of fire plan where they can shift their attacks? So now you're getting your first line suppressed, the enemy drives through it, and then their second line gets suppressed. So you can see here that it's all about, does the enemy know you're there? So being able to have multiple layers without the enemy knowing about those layers. And in today's day and age, that's very difficult because your defenses are much easier to detect than in prior ages. But like in World War II, oftentimes the Germans wouldn't know that the Soviets had additional forces that they could bring in. The final part of your defense in depth is your mobile reserve, your tank guys or mechanized force or whatever. And these guys are generally much further back. But as soon as that, you want to start thinking about committing them as early as possible. For example, on D-Day, the mobile reserve wasn't quite ready to go. And so they had a lot of trouble getting to the beaches to do any sort of resistance. And on top of that, you can have other threats that can disrupt your mobile reserve from getting attacked. So at the operational and strategic level, you might want your mobile reserve to be much further back. But at the tactical level, you actually want the opposite. You want to be able to react very quickly. So you would want them a little further forward. But the problem is, again, that puts them at more risk of getting disrupted or destroyed before they can even do anything. So now let's say that the enemy is kind of in between your forces and you're able to just bring in your tanks and push them out of there. Now the enemy artillery is maybe tapering off a bit and your own artillery can start doing some damage, and suddenly this battle is starting to look a lot better. But generally what happens is the enemy is just trying to poke and figure out what your situation is. Is there a weak area? And having this tactical depth is really hard to keep quiet, for one thing. It's easy to see via satellite. But if you can be tricky about it and, have depth and bait the enemy in and then destroy them, one of the major ways that this is done in today's day and age is with mines. So instead, then this is kind of the Russian way of war here. Instead of having these guys up front here, like the German doctrine would say, you don't have anything. You just put a minefield. So now this tank guy, they say it's all cleared all the mines. Well, what happens when there's a second minefield right behind it that they didn't know about? They didn't see from satellite imagery because maybe you did your mine laying at night and you buried everything nicely, and their analysis team is so busy with the wider war that the intelligence guys didn't detect the mines. Well, now you have your guys driving into a potential slaughter, because once they're in this minefield, now your artillery can get the work done. And now it makes a lot of sense to keep your artillery out of range of the enemy artillery, because you have everything keyed off of the location of this minefield. And the whole purpose of your artillery is just to be able to attack anything that goes into the mines. And so this version of defense in depth is much more efficient at using your manpower, because you are not risking your human lives. It is more expensive in terms of munitions, because you have to be able to lay tons and tons of mines. You have to be able to shoot a lot of artillery, but you don't have to worry about your guys necessarily getting killed while they're standing sentry duty. So it has a lot of benefits, and this is both the Soviet and to some extent the Western way of war, where you are using firepower in place of sentries and manpower. To some extent, you can never quite replace manpower, because you still always are going to have these real defenses to prevent the enemy from getting through. So let's say they have a mine clearing team and your artillery is, put out of action by enemy airstrikes or enemy artillery. Well, now you got to get your manpads out, or your Panzerschrecks, or whatever sort of anti-mobile device you have, your muskets, and you got to go out there and stop them. So defense in depth will always require, to some extent, a real force to back it up. You can never just have that initial soft line. It relies on having a strong line as well. But the efficient way to do it is to have that soft line be able to detect the enemy, delay the enemy, and hopefully stop the enemy in its tracks, and in a place where your own artillery or your own airstrikes or your own troops can then deal with the threat. So it's all to buy time. And then your second line is to hold fast, and your third line is there just in case the second line didn't quite work. And your mobile reserve is there to counterattack when the battle starts to be turning. So then you bring your tanks, and then suddenly you find their artillery, and you're like, great, now we win. But that's a very quick overview of what defense in depth looks like through different eras and through the beautiful example of command modern operations. Now, a quick note about command modern operations. I don't know if any of you are friends with me on Steam. You'll probably notice that I have a negative review of this game. And as a game, I do think it is not a great product. I don't think it's all that fun to play as a game. But for stuff like this, where you're just using it as a map and you're using the database to show examples, I actually think it's a great product, and it's really nice. Now, do I wish it was easier to use GIS layers with this? Yeah, but I guess that's what the professional versions are for. Now, if you're a wargamer professional and you've used CMO for your professional needs, you'll probably be cringing at how I'm using this, but frankly, I barely touch this unless I want to, use it for an example. So I do apologize if I bothered anyone with my usage of CMO. Until next time, See ya.